So, welcome back and thank you for joining me again. Shortly after my having moved into my first Manhattan apartment, I was presented with two enticing bits of information by my building superintendent, Pete. Firstly, folk singer Phil Oakes had both lived and taken his life in his apartment just 2 floors below mine. Already a strange and haunting vibe to deal with. Well, anyway, he'd planned a big presidential win party in 1972 for McGovern that turned into a pretty morose evening for everyone involved, including a very, very sullen John Lennon. The story went that Abby Hoffman had Lennon tag along with him to Prince Street, if only to have a partner to weep over a glass or two of whatever brew Mr. Oakes had on hand. What happened was, Lennon ended up in Phil's bedroom where a little later that night, Yoko Ono found him in flagrante delicto with another woman, thus beginning their very long separation. Pete's second tempting tidbit was that Meryl Streep was seen, on occasion, buying oranges at the Korean market practically next door to us. He was pretty sure she had some kind of pied-à-terre in our Soho neighborhood. My palate had yet to be met with the heat that comes from Korean cuisine, and thus began my lifelong love affair with kimchi and other things Asian. Back then, in 1981, country mouse me was fastly adjusting to city life like I'd never experienced it before. I was close to being deafened by the ringing of the Rube bell inside of my head as I charted territory that some would have considered no man's land back then. Prior to my landing this apartment, I had no idea where or what Soho was. Taking my first taxi from Penn Station, the cabbie told me it meant nothing more than south of Houston Street. What lay before me was anything but just. I sowed seeds like breadcrumbs, leading me to all places east, west, and central in Manhattan. Soho was a downtown gateway to pretty much everything that the borough had to offer me. And as I'd been a dedicated Beantown pedestrian for the past 6 years, my strolling uptown to 100th Street became a common thing and a great way to save on train fare, too. The calm that came with returning to nest inside of my quiet, affordable studio apartment wedded nicely to the stomach steel I was developing from delving into things Korean after my frequent Meryl might be in the market treks. But I digress. So let me briefly recap last week's post. I'd been hired for my 3-day gig as a background extra, and shortly after I reported for the first day's night shoot at Grand Central Station, I was parted from our rank and file and told to sit solo inside of an empty commuter car. I thought I was being punished for a crime I was totally unaware of having committed. And after what seemed like a too long stretch inside of my void, there was a sudden flush of activity filling the car to capacity. But the cheese that was I stood alone, or rather remained obediently seated alone and ignored. Shortly after landing even deeper inside of my pit of woe, a busy little entourage, a gaggle of hair and makeup women, made their way into the car and began advancing in my direction. Another woman followed in their wake. The sea of hair and makeup parted, and lo and behold, this woman, my lady of the oranges, sat confidently beside me in our quiet row for 2. Meryl Streep was sitting next to me. I remember a pair of hands fiddling with her hair while she remained patient and focused, and just as soon as these women left the car, she bowed her head low and proceeded to shake away all of what they'd fussed over. What a woman! She leaned back, and I just breathed the whole thing in. Jesus, Meryl Streep is really sitting next to me. Well, what happened next was fast and furious. I was given a modicum of direction involving her exit, and my having to follow her behind immediately, further thwarting Robert De Niro's attempt to make contact with her after having pushed his way through a sea of exiting background train passengers. By the way, this was the movie that reunited both stars after their Deer Hunter success. Falling in Love, the name of the movie, is an underrated polar opposite of a film. Beautifully, sensitively photographed, wistful, and poignant. You should really try to see it sometime. Well, needless to say, by the time we were wrapped, I was spinning. Little did I know how hard I'd hit the floor later that next shooting day, once the dizzy spell had passed. Turning the page to that long ago and never forgotten tomorrow of yesteryear, we were at a different location that following day, and we were told that our originally promised day 3 of employment was now just a possibility, not an actuality. So, as our day ended early, and as we hadn't been told to hold, I had just time enough to find another booking with another casting director to make up for my loss of work. I mean, wasn't this the way it was done if nothing was etched in stone? Guess again. Right on the heels of my having accepted the new gig, a call came in from Sylvia Fay herself, giving me the third and final day's reporting time. I explained the situation, thinking that she'd surely understand my predicament. She did not. I was instead read the riot act by a woman who was terrifying at her most soft-spoken. It was at least comforting to know that I'd not wasted the Sturm and Drang of the night before. I was at last able to embrace my having committed the biggest sin a background extra could commit, the one that flew way beyond the gravitas of mortal sinning. If you're hired for 3 days, hold for 3 days. As I learned many years after this, if you make the decision to run with the rules of background, you'll have to hold and hold and hold. 6 times out of 10, the days you've been promised will materialize. But if they don't, there's rarely any recourse. You just have to eat the loss. Sylvia told me, in no uncertain terms, that I would never work for her again. And so, my first experience of the industry's hard-knock pattern of dispensability was painfully learned. In actuality, I did work for Sylvia many times after many years following those 2 days. But after that first time at the rodeo, I decided to put the union rate behind me and stick to theater and return to the temp pool. Background had left a complex taste in my mouth, a tantalizing mix of things sweet and bitter, not unlike my recent Korean acquaintance. Both had thankfully thickened my skin a bit. Over the next 15 years, with the exception of an occasional gig here and there, I put all background work behind me. I had new and richer rejections ahead of me to entertain. However, that complex extra taste was warmly welcomed back again in 2009. Much richer flavors and cumulatively easier to digest situations were to follow, all of them shared with a newfound coterie of BPCs, background platoon compatriots. In time, and after another 600 sets, I became very grateful for the experience. But I digress. And thank you for listening.